All right, folks, welcome to Learn with W3 Schools. This is Dr. Zeeshan Bhatti, and today we're going to begin and understand how we can learn JavaScript or ReactJS framework very quickly and easily in 2025. So, let's start with a question. Have you ever wondered how modern websites feel so fast and interactive, like your favorite social media platforms or those sleek e commerce websites? The magic is often powered by ReactJS. Today, I will guide you step by step through the basics of React. We will demystify all the required Node React.js components and its hooks and states. No prior experience needed. But you do need to understand how JavaScript works. Okay, so if you have understood JavaScript, if you haven't, you can watch my video on JavaScript already. We will tackle a common challenges many beginners face from choosing and mastering JavaScript framework. So React is a powerful, flexible, and in-demand skill that will elevate your web development game. All right. So by the end of this course, you will be confident enough to build a small functional React app. And trust me, it feels awesome when you see your own code come to life. So let's dive in. Now, here's what we will cover today. So to be very specific, these are basic topics that I will be covering to ensure this course is in a specific order. We will start with the basics, introducing you to the React and its advantages. Then we will set up the environment and dive into React's unique syntax, including JSX, components, and props. Once we have got the hang of this, we will explore state management, lifecycle methods, and some handling user interactions. We will also try to build a simple React app together. Hands-on learning is the best. And finally, we will touch on some advanced topics like context API hooks to give you a taste of what lies ahead. So some exciting topics to cover. Sounds hopefully really interesting. So let's begin and delve into the React.js environment. Now, first thing, what exactly is React.js? So by the end of this course, you will understand what exactly is React.js and what you expect from it. You will know exactly what React.js is and why developers love it. You will see and set up your first React.js project and learn to write the JSX with the special syntax React uses to make the UI easy to manage. We will dive into components. Think of them as the building blocks of your app, and you will see how to pass the data between them using something called props. Managing dynamic data, that's where the state comes in, and we will make sure you are comfortable with it as well. So you will learn how to handle user interactions, build a small project, and even get a sneak peek into the advanced React features. So that makes this learning journey fun and exciting. Now, the first thing is first. What exactly is React.js? You need to be very specific and clear about it. And as many students tend to be very confused about understanding what exactly React.js is. So the React.js is a JavaScript library, not a full-fledged framework. It's a lesser focused on building user interactions and user interfaces. Imagine you are creating a website, the buttons, the forms, the layouts, and all those things that goes inside a website. React is perfect for that because it creates what we call a modular components that you can structure on top of each other to design an entire component. That's what the basic purpose is, using primarily JavaScript. That's why I say need to understand JavaScript and then you can build on that. So it's like a library code with it. So React was developed by Facebook and it powers their web application. So if you have used Facebook, the entire interface and the structure, every component basically nowadays uses React. Along with the Instagram and many other big names nowadays use React. It's an incredibly popular because it's fast, it's scalable, and it's a big one. Reusable. That's the key feature here. The big thing, reusable. This reusable feature allows us to manage everything. Now, why you should learn React? First, it's component based. By component based, we mean that everything you build inside the React is built on components. So actually you are building small components. Then you stack those components in a larger website. That's how they tend to work. That's what makes it more fun. And then you can reuse the same component on a different web layout, on a different web page, on a different structure as well as you place them. That way, your code becomes reusable. So every website tends to have a different look and feel, but backend the same components can be used. You can create small reusable pieces and combine them to build a much complex structures. That's the React for you. Okay, that's the how we use React to design a UI components. Second is fast, and that's the major advantage. It just works like that. React uses something called a virtual DOM. When something changes on your site, React updates only when necessary, making your app super responsive. Third, React has a massive community and ecosystem. Need a library for routing or animation? Chances are someone already has built it. Okay, so that's what the basic idea is. It hits all the key parts. It's a component base, it's fast, it's rich in ecosystem, it's a declarative syntax, makes UI predictable and easier to debug, and then it's a cross-platform development. The React is basically able to run on every single application. That's why it's so loved and it has huge advantage over any other framework. This becomes its key strength. All these five things that becomes like key pillars of why you need to understand and learn React. Okay, cool. So now once you have done understand the basics, let's start the developing environment. For me, I will be using VsCode, but you can use any other editor. Always recommended. VsCode is now like standard go-to, so it's much easier and it has tons of extensions that you can use to customize lots of things within React. Okay, but before you go into VS Code, you will need to install this thing called Node.js. So just head on to Google, download the Node.js, and then need to install this npm using the Node.js. You need these two things inside VS Code, and you're good to go. Then you can create a new React app using the npx create app and my app code. So you just write this code here, npx create React app, and then provide your app name. Any app name would be fine. Again, I have a detailed video of how to set up, download, install VS Code to Node.js to npm, creating your first project. I will leave the link in the description below, or you can check it out in the eye. Before diving into these files, let's understand what the React folder structure is. React organizes its files in a logical way to make your application easy to build and maintain. There are three key files we will work with today. First is this index.html file. This file is the root of your app. It's HTML file where your React app is injected. Then we're going to talk about the main.jsx. This is the first file. Here's the second one. This is the JavaScript entry point for your app, where the React DOM renders your app. Then third, we're going to talk about app.jsx. This is your main application component where all the magic happens. The React makes it simple, but understanding how these files interact is the first step to mastering ReactJS. Alright, so let's start with index.html. You will find this file in the main app root folder of your React project. It's plain HTML file, but it's incredibly important. So find this index.html file. This is our entry point, the main file, the first thing that gets loaded as an output on the browser. Why? Because this is main HTML file that renders on your browser, and it contains a div tag, this div tag here, that allows our React.js components to render the content and then replace this div with the React content. So this is where your entire React app will be rendered. Think of it like an anchor point for your app. So working with React.js, the first thing we look in your project folder is this index.html. It's outside of any of these directories inside the main folder. It contains your basic structure of an HTML page. We don't need to change anything. Just keep in mind there's a div called root here. This word root is quite important because we use this root to replace this HTML content with our React.js content. Now also note that it contains a script tag that replaces an src main.jsx, meaning that this file is being referred to as a file in this thing here, main.jsx. So it's referring that this main index will actually contain a script file from main.jsx. This becomes our second main point. So when we're working with React.js, the first entry point is always this index.html, which actually gets executed first, and it is rendered on the browser. When it renders on the browser, it technically only contains this div here. that has this root ID, and it loads a script called main.jsx. So what exactly is main.jsx? Now, this this main index.html is found in the main app folder. It contains a div ID root where React renders the app. Okay, so now we talk about this main.jsx. Main.jsx exists within our src folder. So inside this src folder, we have main.jsx. So for this main.jsx, the root folder is src, and for the src will be your project folder or any project folder for that matter. So go inside your src, and this is where we start changing our code. This is our entry point to React.js. Okay, again, this is not the actual or the where we do the actual coding. This is just like a main file for our React.js. It renders the React app into the DOM object model for using HTML and JavaScript. So what this file main contains is that, hey, I have a root. It needs to find a element called root inside your index.html and then render the React component on that root element. So the idea again goes, we have a to-do app component. We want to render that component on a element that contains an ID called root. So this main.js actually links your index file with React.js. So they both are quite important. Okay, once you follow that, then the app.jsx components, to it basically links that app.jsx with the link file. So means that you actually write the entire code inside this app.jsx. So we write everything inside this app.jsx. This contains the main code, but the main code is not directly rendered on the browser. It's a component. That's what we call in React.js. It's like a one single block of code that does one single task. So to display this block on the code on the browser, you actually need this main.jsx. So we create a block, and then we use this main.jsx to organize and structure our components, our blocks together. So it's like we create multiple different blocks, and then we use this main.jsx. So this becomes our main.jsx. This becomes our main major block, the main thing. Inside it, we have these individual small blocks. Okay, so it connects everything. So once we have everything inside main.jsx, then we use this main.jsx with the index.html file. So we come here and we use this main.js and link it with index.html. That's how everything works. Make sense? Perfect. Okay, so basically idea is you have index.html, you don't temper change it, you just use the root. Then main has these files here. It finds this root ID and renders all your React.js components onto this index file. But main has a major aspect. It's like a container that combines all your Lego blocks together. So we define app.jsx that contains all your code, but this is one single component. There can be many other components. So using main, we actually structure and organize. In this case, we only have one component here to do app, but there can be many other as well. Every component is structured, organized, and then we use that inside our main.jsx. So finally, we come to our components. This is where app.jsx comes into play. So this is where this app.jsx is an important file. So this is the main component. Remember, you can create multiple components, or we usually do create multiple components in React.js. You can create all of them inside your app.jsx, or usually, as I like to do it, I create a separate file. So in this case, for example, I have a to-do app file. So this becomes my separate component. And similarly, I can create multiple other files. Each component can be in a separate file. So the root component, within our file, we have something called a app that becomes our root component. This root component holds the components and defines the entire app logic within our code. That's how the React.js basically works. So what we're trying to do now is we're trying to create an app.jsx that contains an app component that holds all the logic and the building blocks of what this individual component is supposed to do. Similarly, you can have another to-do list, another component. This will behave like a second component. Similarly, I can create a third component. I can create fourth, five. So there can be any number of components within your React.js, each having a separate .jsx file. So this will again be .separate JSX file. This will be separate JSX file. Similarly, this as well. Similarly, this as well. Then you use this main.html to combine and structure all the files together. Once this main dot holds all these files together, so this now becomes our main.jsx. So you build all these building blocks together as a separate files or within one, then you combine them inside the main to structure and define how these components are going to be organized and layout. Then you use this main.layout to render your component on this index file here. So this main actually is thrown on the index as a whole container, and it contains these individual components. So that's how these three file structure works with hand to hand. Okay, so I hope you understand that. So what's happening is that app component is a simple function that returns JCS. So when we type this, it's returning the simple JSX components. So JSX is basically like an HTML inside a JavaScript. It what makes React so intuitive. This component is exported out as due to this return value so that it can be imported in the render and inside the main JSX. Make sense? Wonderful. So now you would understand that we use primarily index.html to render the component on the final browser, but index needs this main.jsx. This main.jsx is then again used inside our, if I go back here, so first we start with the index, then index uses the component to display on the browser, but it needs a main component which is again main.jsx, which is this whole major component. This main.jsx holds individual components together that can come from a single file or multiple files in this case. Okay, so there can be multiple JSX files that can be components, and we organize them inside the main.jx and then throw it on there. So that's how our whole folder structure works. Finally, don't forget that we also have to use assets, images, logos, and other aspects as well. To do that, we basically come here and go inside our assets folder. Everything related to your project that is not a source code JSX file actually goes inside the assets folder. In this case, we have an SVG. We can do that. Or we can have images, JPEG, PNG. All your files actually go inside your assets folder. And then you can refer them using this. So in this case, we are using React SVG. So we are referring this using this React link ./assets/ the file name. So any image you have, you can save inside the assets folder, and then you can use it simply as that using this link. So here what we're doing is we're importing this asset and saving it inside this variable called React logo. Now wherever I want to print that React logo, I will basically use that simple name within the image tag. Simple as that. Okay, so all assets actually are stored inside this assets folder. Don't forget that. In this case, we are using SVG, which is basically an XML containing a link to your particular file or a logo online. Okay, make sense? Wonderful. So now understanding the JSX, let's get into the code of ReactJS. The first major component is you need to follow the ReactJS Node.js, this JSX feature. Okay, so let's talk about this first. JSX stands for JavaScript XML. Think of it as a way to write HTML like code directly inside your JavaScript files. This might look a little strange at first, but it's a super handy feature that React has. So why we use JSX? Well, it makes your UI crystal clear. Instead of juggling JavaScript DOM manipulations, you can just write something like h1 hello world \h1 inside your JavaScript, and the React will take care of the rendering it for you on the screen. One thing to note though is that JSX isn't mandatory. Okay, so many people confuse it with that. JSX is not mandatory. You can use it without a JSX, but that's, for me, I believe that JSX makes your React more, more React itself. So that's the framework comes into life when you use JSX. Okay, you could write plain JavaScript for that matter. So if you're not using JSX, you can write plain JavaScript. But trust me, JSX is so much easier and more fun to work with. okay, and it will make your life much more easy. So let's dive into some examples of how this JSX thing works. So this is the first basic example one, displaying a heading using a simple JSX. Okay, so just a simple project just to give you an idea of how JSX works. So imagine if you have an HTML and a JavaScript had a baby. That's JSX. It lets you write HTML syntax directly into your JavaScript files. This makes your code much easier to read, to write, and to debug. So here's the catch though. JSX must always be wrapped in a single parent element. Meaning that, for example, I have this element and I write this HTML code. That's it. That's all you need to do. But this has to be a single HTML element. If there are more, then again you need to have a parent and then it can contain a child. Okay, that way it's easier to just throw one parent and everything inside it into a React object. I will show you an example. You will get a better idea of what exactly I mean by that. But this is what typically is. This is how JSX works. So we just write an HTML. We save it inside a variable here. Again, there are various ways, but this is one of the easiest way to work with. Then we use something called React DOM.render. Don't worry, I will talk about this in a moment. And then we just pass this variable here that, hey, I want to render this component on my screen. Where do you want to render it? Inside my document dot get element by id, and there's an element called root. Just go there and render it. Now if you're familiar with JavaScript, this is a typical JavaScript DOM, and then we use a React DOM, which is basically creating a virtual DOM. Okay, so this creates a virtual DOM that allows us to easier and faster manipulation, and then we render this component entirely on this virtual React DOM. The output is we'll get a simple HTML page saying hello React. That's how simple it works. Now every React component needs to have a React DOM dot render. Element basically is your HTML content that you want to render, and then it needs to have this line here. So typically you would use this code almost every single time. The only thing that's going to change is this part here. Okay, so this main HTML part is you're going to change basically. Every React component needs this line here to render the components on the DOM. Let's look into another example. Okay, so as I tried to explain, using examples is best way of understanding various different things, right? So let's see this. How do we embed JavaScript in JSX? So if you need to embed JavaScript in JSX, this is a basic native way. So in this example, notice how we embed JavaScript inside a curly brackets. This one. This makes your code UI dynamic and interactive. It keeps experimenting and using JavaScript much easier within your HTML. So by just providing these brackets, you are telling your system that, hey, I am using a JavaScript here. No other function needed, no script tag needed. Just simply provide this basic feature of curly brackets. So we have an HTML tag. Inside this, we have this JavaScript code. And everything else, see this, everything else is same. So when this renders, it's going to use JavaScript to do 5 plus 3. The answer is going to be rendered and it's going to print 8. Why? Because we have used this curly brackets. So this curly brackets makes everything so much fun. Okay, and this can be used anywhere. So now this is sometimes also called JavaScript expression. Okay, we also refer to this as, hey, this is my JavaScript expression. This meaning that every time you want to use a JavaScript with HTML, we use this angle square, these curly brackets, things, right? So this is another point to note about using React. You can use HTML and you can embed a JavaScript within HTML as well, as long as you use the curly brackets. That's all is needed. Let's look into another example, displaying a greeting message very simply. Okay, and it combines all these three things. So now what we do is we create something called a basic function component. Okay, so using a JSX. So in this code, we create a function called greeting. This one. Inside it, we define a variable name and set it to Dr. Zeeshan. So in this case, I have a constant variable name and then I set it to Dr. Zeeshan. Obviously, this becomes a string. You can set it to var or let for that matter as well. Now, what exactly we mean by constant and function? If you have done JavaScript, you would understand exactly what this means. Again, my detailed videos on JavaScripts, functions, methods, and everything is already on my channel. Do check out the links in the descriptions. You can find them if you have not already idea of how JavaScript works. You do need a little bit of JavaScript with that. Once you know that, we have a function, we create a constant, we create a variable name. Now I want to print this name inside my HTML. So now what we done is we create an HTML hello, and then we use this JavaScript function here. So now you note this one is my JavaScript. This here is what we call my JavaScript code because I've used the curly brackets. Now, because I want to print the variable's value inside this JavaScript, I just simply use the variable name, provide a curly bracket within the curly brackets. This will simply render into printing the variable name here. Because JavaScript, we can print the name of variables, or we can print the value or data what's inside the variables. Okay, so we are using JavaScript here with HTML. That's how simply it's done. And then we use export default greeting. Now what exactly this whole code means? In terms of React, we have just created our first reusable component called greeting. This first reusable component makes our life much easier. This is what we call a component is. Okay, this is a component. This is like a single Lego block. Every time I need to print this or use this, I will just simply call this component greeting. In a standard JavaScript, we call this as a function. In a standard React, we call this a component. Whatever goes inside it, it depends on what exactly you want to do. Each component needs to have a return type, and it needs to return this HTML code. So a component has this like two basic rules. Again, there are a few more, but we'll get into it. But the first basic is you use the forward function, you provide a component name, and then you use this return type. Every JavaScript code, you will be creating these components. The rest of the code almost becomes just redundant. Okay, and then we set this line, export default greeting. This basically means that I'm exporting this component from a single file as a component. So this can be used in another files anywhere else, can be imported as a component. So basically meaning that you have a separate web page, you have created a component and you want to import this component here. Okay, making it reusable. So you are importing it inside this. Then you can have another web page. Okay, and then inside this web page again you want to use this component. So you can import this component here as well. So this also using it. So this you're gonna basically use the import to import it here. You're gonna again use import to import it here. So by allowing it export, we are telling it, hey, this component can be easily exported and used in other applications as well. Make sense? Okay, perfect. So creating a component using a function. We use a function name. We define its body. This creates our single block. That's it. That's the whole logic behind it. Obviously, inside it, it needs to have a return statement. It needs to have an HTML code. Two other logics. Then we just set it to export default greeting outside the block, letting it know, hey, you can export it. So now let's make our app much more smarter. This example greets users based on the time of the day. We use a date.getHours function to find out the current hour. Then a simple ternary operator decides whether to say good morning or good afternoon or even good evening. So React automatically updates the greeting whenever the code runs. This dynamic behavior is what makes React so powerful. You're not just writing a code, you are creating an experience. Understand that? Again, so we create what we call a component here. This becomes my reusable component in React. So every time we create something using function, define a function name, bracket start, bracket close. In React, we call it a component, which basically means a block of code that can be reused every single time. Ensuring it can be used, we use this export default and then just a function name. This means that this can easily be exported and imported into another components. That's what a reusable component is. What you put inside it is your choice. But then again, remember from the last slide, we said it needs still two main things. The first is the return statement, and then the return must return an HTML. Okay, that's the second rule. For each component, you start with the block and block close. You start with a function name. You give it any standard name. That's the standard way. The two rules that we need to follow is it must contain the return statement and it must return an HTML component. That's the key logic with it. Okay, cool. Now what we have done here is we have used date.getHours function within, again, this is from JavaScript by the way. Okay, so we are combining JSX as a JavaScript notation and we are using get me current date, save it inside the hours, constant greetings, We are using hours is less than 12 question mark. If it's true, say print good morning, or hours less than 18 question mark. If that's the case, print good afternoon or good evening. A simple tertiary operator that allows us to check how things working. This is again a simple like if else conditions. If you are familiar with if else, excellent. If you are not, again you need to familiarize with yourself using again the basic JavaScript. So this becomes my one component. Every time this code runs, it's going to check our current system date. Based on the date, it's going to greet us. Hey, greeting, this thing. So now again returning h1, we are actually printing the greeting message. So whatever the condition becomes true based on the time, this message is going to get printed inside here. These curly brackets indicate this is a JavaScript expression. So this JavaScript expression actually gets executed at this time here from this variable value. Wonderful, makes sense. That's all the React is. Now every time you want to use this thing, this is how we're going to use it. So let's begin and let's talk about what exactly are React components. Now, React components are building blocks of your app. Imagine building a Lego model. Each Lego piece represents a React component. And when you connect them together, you build something functional and beautiful. With React, you can reuse these components, access your application, saving time and effort. Plus, React makes it super easy to manage complex UIs by breaking them into smaller, manageable parts. Imagine your app is basically a puzzle and each piece of is a React component. Okay. Components lets you break down the complexity of your app into a smaller reusable pieces. So instead of creating one giant component, you basically create small pieces together. Okay. Then you stack and combine each pieces together to build one complete application. That way you have much more control of what your application is, and then you have something called a reusable components, means you can reuse these same components multiple times within an app or in another applications as well. So instead of writing everything in one big messy file, you create independent self-contained blocks of UI that do one thing and do it well. Components can either be functional or for a simpler tasks or class based, managing more complex behaviors. Okay, so typically most of the time we end up using the functional components, which is nowadays what we call the stateless component. However, there are something called stateful components or class components. Not so common in latest updated versions. Especially after the update version, we end up still using most commonly this functional component, or as we call them, stateless. Okay, so let's look into the example of a component first. So interactivity is what React excels at. With event handlers, you can make your components respond to users' actions like clicking a button or typing in a box. So for example, if I have to create a basic component, the way I do it is that once I click on a button, I create a constant creating, which becomes my component, is equals to bracket start bracket close, arrow function. Okay, so this is what we call an arrow function looks like, which is dynamically creating an component, bracket start bracket close. Each component needs to have a return type, which is again one of the most mandatory rules, and then this return type needs to return an HTML. Okay, this basically combines our simple component. Now let's look into that. How does a React component work? React components are smart. They know how to take data, render it as an HTML, and update themselves when something changes. In our shopping list example, the shopping list components passes each item to the items components when they render it. So think of this as a information exchange between your entire website. So how do they work? They basically allow us to render a UI elements. Component receive inputs, for example, using the props, which basically means arguments. Okay, so we pass data using these arguments, and the return output, which is again HTML, which means basically our web page. Okay, so this is how it works. Components, this is the first thing. They may need the inputs or arguments or what we call the props, and they generate the output. Okay, so the input form is basically this thing. We get input, the output is HTML, and they combine together in form of a component. So this is how the component basically works. React takes these components the React takes care of updating the DOM efficiently using a virtual DOM model. So what happens is, as we know that it's a JavaScript, JavaScript uses a DOM model, and then again, obviously React also is heavily implied on the DOM. So DOM is very efficiently implied and updated using this React. With this DOM, React actually uses something called virtual DOM. We have talked about this in our detailed React videos, but that's how our React component works. So data flow, the parent component can pass the data to a child component through props. So our parent component can pass the data to a child component using the props mechanism. Again, using the same assignment. Child components can communicate changes back using the callback function as well. So in other words, we have a parent, and inside the parent we have a child component. So this becomes my child and this becomes my parent. Okay, so now parent can pass the data to the child, as well as child can also refer back the data to the parent using something called a callback function. So using this callback function, a child can pass the data as well. Okay, so I hope you understand this concept easily. So let's explore and dive more into these components that I've just discussed. So it's time to understand exactly what it is, because the component is the backbone of React. Think of components as a Lego bricks of your app. They are reusable, independent, and help you build complex interfaces with ease. Components are like reusable Lego bricks of React. You can create a small pieces of UI like buttons, headers, and reuse it throughout your app. There are two types of components, functional and class components. Okay, so this functional or a class component basically allow us to understand what type of code we are doing. The functional components are just like JavaScript functions that I showed you in previous two examples. They are straightforward and lightweight, and nowadays most of the people tend to use these functional components because they're much more easy and they avoid a little bit of complexity of creating classes. For my reference as well, in this tutorial as well as other tutorials to follow, I tend to use functional components a lot. But you might find certain older examples that could use class components, and again they are valid, they are legitimate. Up till now they have not been depreciated, so you can still use them. So these class components are a bit older and they use words to handle state and life cycle. This word actually, right? So this is quite easy but not so common anyway. Again, so nowadays with hooks, functional components are more common. So let's build few components to see how they really work. I've already shown you two examples. Let's explore one more example now. So in this case, we have a very simple functional component, again revisiting from the previous example. So we create a function called welcome. Okay, so every functional component needs to start with a function. We provided a function name, bracket start, bracket close. Then it needs to have the first rule, return, and it must return an HTML. That's the second rule. That's it. That's the basic two things that you need to understand for a React component. This becomes our component. See how easy it is. Now, in order to process it or use it, we say react dom dot render, and we call the function or the component like this. Now this can be in the same file. In this example, I've used it inside the same file, or in the examples like VsCode, if you're using it, if you create a project from there, this will be your main .jsx file. Okay. So in this case, to use this component, we just simply call it. Again, if you are familiar with JavaScript functions or any standard function, this can be called as a declaring a function. Okay, so this is function declaration. This here is what we call a function call. These are two components or two terminologies we use. We need to declare a function and then we need to call it. Declaration means defining what the function is supposed to do, and then calling means actually want that task, that function to execute that block of code. So same way, because we are using React, we call this as a component. So this is declaring a component and then we are calling a component. Again, declaring a component means we are declaring that what this component is supposed to do. It's going to perform a specific task. In this case, welcome to React. A simple message. Okay. And then to call it, in a typical sense, we just use the function name with the brackets. But because this is React, it has a JSX format, it's going to use these angle brackets. More similar to HTML. So it's going to use the same tag, bracket start, function name, backslash, bracket angle bracket close. That's how you call a function component. Capish? And then document.root will basically mean that within our main file there will be a div tag containing or this root. So wherever there's a root, just print it out there. So now let's look into a more common example of it. A simple header component. So you want to create a component every time you want to execute the code, or on your website you want to reuse the basic header line. So instead of repeating it, you can create a component that can be reused on every single page. In this case, this is a very simple, straightforward. So imagine you need a header for your app that's supposed to repeat. So instead of writing the same code every single time, you just simply create a reusable header component. This header component simply returns an HTML-like structure wrapped inside the JSX. Whenever you need a header, you just import and use this component, easily reusable and clean. So if you have a page 1, you can call this header component. Okay, somewhere around here this header component is called. You can have another page, again this header component is called. You have another page, again you have the same header call. So same code now can be called here, the same code will call be here, the same code called be here. The calling or the using again basically means that every time you need to use it within your main file, you call the header component, her, this header code here. So for this header code, again here you will basically be calling this her header backslash function. Why I'm using the header? Because the name of header. So every time you need to call it, you just simply type in, hey, I want to call this header, and it's going to call this backslash header thing. Simple as that. Okay, so here are more interactive examples. We are creating a button component that logs a message when user clicks on it. Okay, so now let's get into more complex things. So now the basic idea is that we need to create a button component that logs a message every time user clicks on it. So we create a function called button. Okay, so we have a function which basically means we have a component. This component contains another function. Okay, so this is handle click, and then again it simply say console.log button click, and then we're going to say return button. This is again HTML. So this again the first part mandatory, it needs to have a return statement, and then we're going to say button. Again this is an HTML. On click, a simple on click event has been called, and then this is JavaScript. So now here we are calling this simple JavaScript code, which again is in JSX. So we are saying because I call it JavaScript because I have noticed there's a curly brackets. So every time you see a curly brackets means you are calling a specific JavaScript. So inside this JavaScript we are calling this handle function here. Okay, so every time I click on a button, it's going to call the function that I've declared inside my main component. Click me button, simple as that. And then we have provided this export line. Now this basically means that I can now export it. In other words, I can use this button anywhere on my page, on multiple pages. I don't need to recreate the code again and again and again. For this can be used for debugging purpose, for checking purpose, for whatever error checking, or whether the code is working or not. All right, so see, the React makes handling events like this seamlessly easy. Look at this another example, rendering the list. So stateless components are like decorators for your app. They don't hold any internal data, they just take the props and render something based on them. So in this case, we have a simple data that is being passed using the props. So we take item, we create a name data, and then we pass it a function called list item name. So it's taking the prop and then printing the data item here. So when we create a shopping list, we have a bracket start bracket close, which is again defining a component feature in terms of an arrow function, bracket start bracket close. Here we define constant items, milk, egg, and bread. Then we return our HTML. Within this HTML, we have an unordered list, and that unordered list takes this item variables. So this item variables here uses the JavaScript's map function to iterate through each item. So this map function is basically used to iterate through each item in our list. So using the map, we are saying, hey, take this item based on each index, iterate it, and then assign it a particular information, which is in this case the item key. So the item is here, the key becomes our main index, and the name is basically a parameter that we pass it to the name of information as a prop. So what's happening now again in a nutshell is that we are reading the data using a simple JavaScript function called map. This map allows us to read the data of our a list. Okay, so this list is basically allowing us to read the data and then passing that data through our map function to this item variable here. So the first thing is, in other words, we have a list. This list is iterated through our map function. This map function will read line by line the data and call this item component. To this item component, we pass the data. So we say, hey, there's a key, which basically becomes our key value, and then the name of that item. So in other words, we are passing it a key and value information. So this information is passed to this thing here. Okay, so that's how a component is basically working. We are updating the component at real time. Okay, so now let's look at another example of stateless components. Again, stateless components are also known as simple functional components. Simple focus, they basically simply focus on presenting UI. They do not manage or hold any state. That's the key thing. We do not manage or hold any state. Any state means while the program is execution, they maintain the value of some data in memory. Okay, that does not happen. So whenever they pass, they process information and the state is lost. That's why they call it stateless. They usually hold the data using the props. So that's for a stateless components, props is quite important. Okay, again the work is we create a component, hello is equals to, and this is the props. So we pass it the information using the props. They have a return data, they process it, and then they use props.name to process that information. This is a simple example of stateless components. Now, talking more about stateless components are like decorators of your app. They don't hold any internal data. They just take in props and they render something based on them. So in this case, again, we have props. They take in the props, which basically means an argument, an input value, and they process that information. In this example, our welcome component is given a username and it displays a greeting. Simple, right? Think of it like a waiter at a restaurant. They don't cook the food, they just deliver it. So that's how they're basically working. So here we have created another component called app. It returns again HTML content, but this HTML content itself is a component called welcome. So this welcome is actually being referred to this welcome here. So from one component we are calling another component. Quite possible, easily done. Then this component takes something called a prop, meaning another argument. So we provided argument in a key is equals to value pair. Okay. So now username becomes our key. Zeeshan, my name, becomes value. So when we pass this information as a whole, this whole becomes one single prop, and this prop is actually passed to this props variable. In order to use it, we use the props, which is again this variables dot username. So the username actually is coming from here. The props is actually coming from here. That's how we actually use the information in a stateless components, meaning passing the data between components from one component to another component using props. Now, so let's break it down. Props are like packages of information that one component can send to another. They are always passed down the component tree, like parents giving advice to their kids. Hey, here's your name, age, and favorite color. That becomes your information. So props carry that information from one parent to the child, even from one component to another component, from one person to another. Props are immutable, so we need to be very understandable of that as well. That props are immutable means they cannot be changed, meaning the receiving components can't change them as well. So the value, once you pass through the props, the property, for example, once your parent set your name, you technically can't change it. This makes our components predictable and easy to debug. So that's why we always say props are what we call read only. Now, props are awesome, but why? Props are like secret sauce that makes React components so flexible. Imagine building a UI where everything is connected and dynamic. That's what props help you achieve. Need a profile card that updates for every user, or a button that triggers different actions based on the screen? Props make it happen, and they do it in a clean, organized way. That becomes the major advantage of using it, facilitating basic communication between components. So you can have two components, and props will allow you to communicate to and fro between the components as well. They encourage something called reusability by allowing components to adopt based on incoming props. Simply they do simplify the complex UI by breaking it into small manageable pieces. So based on the different requirements, data that we need to process, we can create more components and just pass them props and they can work on that. The application can be dynamic, user interface, interactive components, or reusable components and whatnot. Now, after the components, there are a few more things that go inside a component. They are known as props. Props are like arguments you pass to a function. In React, the way the components communicate with each other is through the props. Okay, so they are like arguments, data that you pass to your components, and the components then work on that data. So props are always passed from a parent component to a child component. They are read only, meaning you can't change them inside the component, and they are all passing data down, not editing it. So basic logic is that if you have some data, you pass this data to another component and you can use it. This component will be able to use this data but not change it. Okay, this is becomes what we call the read only thing. You cannot modify or change it. So it cannot be modified or changed. Right? Understand? So it's like passing some piece of information, like you hear something on your voice, you call somebody, you're hearing their voice and the message is received. Now you cannot change it because it's in voice, it's on their message. All you can do is receive that message. Based on message you can process and do your task, but you cannot change the original message. That's what the props are. So props are like gifts you pass from one component to another. They allow parent components to send the data to their children. Okay, so in React, props are read only, meaning you can use them but you cannot change them. So that's what basically props are. They are read only. The way we define it, the syntax is quite simple. We have a component. Again, the way we call the component, then we pass it the props name. So the prop name is equals to the value. So in other words, this becomes my key is equals to its value. This is the logic that we pass. This key can be any given name. In React, we call them prop name is equals to any value. So for example, I can say, hey, I have name is equals to and myself. So now name becomes my prop is equals to its value. So we can call it a prop, or in a general JavaScript term, we call it a key is equals to the value there is. So in order to use this, I use the prop. So this is what we also in a general term call arguments. Okay, we are passing argument to our component. Let's look at an example to understand this in a better way. Okay, so now we are passing our username to basically our child component. So here notice we have created a very simple component called function. But before I go into it, I will use this. See this user. This comes from this user component. Name is equal to John Doe. All right. So we are saying, hey, I have a user component. If there were no argument previously, remember we just use the component. Calling means just use the component name, angle brackets close. That's calling the component. But here, because we are passing an argument, we pass it name is equals to John Doe. So this is what typically passing of an argument looks like. If this was a standard function, okay, if in a JavaScript standard function or any other programming for that matter, the way we write it is we use, for example, we would written it as a user bracket start, and then we had written the value, for example, in other words, let's just say my name, okay, semicolon. This is what we call an argument looks like. Then this is what we call function calling. Yeah. So function declaration, or the declaration would actually look like, in this case, for example, a variable called a name, and then we would use that variable name. In the React, we always use the word props. That's like the limitation or some strange reason. Every time you're using this, you always end up using something called props. You have to use with the function, the component name, use props. Okay, that's how it knows that you're passing an argument. In a typical environment, for example, if this was a standard JavaScript, again, I would use something called function. I would say user, and I would use a variable name called name, bracket start, bracket close, and then I would call this function here. This would be my typical JavaScript function, or any other language for that matter. I would use the name here and then pass the value here. So this becomes name and value pair. But in React, the difference is we always use for some reason the word props. You cannot change that. You should not change that. Then when you pass the argument, actually you pass the variable name with the value itself. So the variable name and the value actually are passed together. So technically we call it key is equals to the value. So the key is name, the value is here. Now how do we access it? Inside the component, we go and we use the props. So because we are using the props as the main keyword here, we are using props dot name, which is again the key here. Okay, so now do notice this square brackets, sorry, the angle brackets, not angle brackets, curly brackets. I always forget. The curly brackets indicate we are using JavaScript. Inside the JavaScript, we are again using the word props. This is the parent name, it has to be used, dot the name that we have provided here. So if this is name, this becomes name. If this is like first name, F name, this would again be F name. So whatever variable name you have provided here, the key becomes same here. That's how you use the props. When you call the component, you provide the argument. Within the function definition or the component definition, you always use the word props. Then to use it in your code, if it is within HTML, you use the curly brackets. If it is not inside the HTML, then you don't need to use the curly brackets, depending on what the code precedes the return statement. Okay, so here we are using the word props and say, hey, I've received, basically props means an argument in other words. So say, hey, I've received some data, I've received an argument, dot basically is a connection between the argument and the value. So the value is actually the key name here. Make sense? A little bit? Yes. So this is what basically passing an argument looks like, or what we call in React the props. Okay. Let's see if you want to pass multiple arguments. Okay. Multiple arguments means that you have a function or a component called product. You're calling the product and you provided argument 1 and then you provided argument 2 and you close the component calling function. So now notice we have given it 2 keys and 2 values separated by space. No comma, no semicolon, or no anything. Everything has been done using the space. So now we are saying, hey, I have a product which is a component and I'm passing it props. One is called name, second is called price. The value of name is laptop. This one, the value of price is 999. Make sense? So this becomes my props calling. Then inside my component, I go and I said, hey, this is a product component name. It will have something called props. Now notice there's only one word called props. Because we're always using props, it means that this component will take some data. Either 1, 2, 3, 4, doesn't really matter. It's just going to always use the word props one time. That's it. So actually it depends on the calling area. So when we call our component, this is where we provide the details. So this is where it tries to understand how many components, how many props actually you are passing. So once you define here, you just define the word props one time. That's it. To use it again, because I'm using it inside an HTML, I use curly brackets to indicate that this is a JavaScript. Props.name will actually refer to props.name this one. Then props.price will actually refer to this price here. Okay. And then $sign is just for the finding the dollar price. So this is how we simply use. So it can be, you can have 2 arguments, you can have 3 arguments, you can have more data provided it. Every time you need to use it, you use it with the word props, which is basically taking it like, I have data and the data is this name or the data is the price. That's how it basically follows. So this is how you pass multiple arguments using the props. Let's look at an example of how props are working. So props are technically very easy to use. When you pass a data to a component, you use an attribute, just like in HTML. In the child component, you access it by using props. So for example, in this case, the parent gives the child a name John or Zeeshan, and the child displays it. So here we created a component called child component. It takes something called a prop. In general sense, and if I'm creating a function in JavaScript, we just simply call them arguments. Okay, so if you have done JavaScript before, or any programming language for that matter, like Java, C#, Python, every language takes arguments when we call a function. So for example, I have a function called my name and I take an argument. This can be a standard function. Okay, so this function in React actually is known as a prop. That's how they basically work. So here you see we created a function called child component and we gave it a prop. That's all it is. That's what exactly a prop is. Bracket start, bracket close. We say hello and we want to use the value inside the prop. So we use this props as a prefix, dot operator, and then the value that it holds. The way it holds the value, in fact, that's where it differentiates from other languages. It holds the value in a key and a value pair. So here name is becoming a key and my name itself becomes the value. Okay, these both things are actually passed to the prop. So both of this are actually passed to the prop. So now here we are creating a component called child component. Basically we are accessing the component inside our another parent component. And when we access the component, because it needs a prop, so we give it a name and value. That's how it basically reads it. So this name and value information is the key thing here. This name and key value. This becomes the props data, and the props itself actually is the accessor component that holds that value. Within it, it actually holds the value in form of key and value pair. So we have props dot name. Now name is not mentioned here, but this name actually is coming from this name here. So this name has been accessed from here. Okay, that's how props work. They are working technically like an argument, but we don't call them argument because argument usually only take a single value, either x or for example value 10. So if I use the variable argument, it will only have a value, something called a single value, x, y, or a character a or a name. Okay, but in this case it holds a key and a value pair. That's why it's known as a little bit different in form of props. So we pass the data by calling the component in key value and it's equals to value pair. This can be a value, integer, number, string, whatever you want. Any standard JavaScript values are actually legally allowed here. That's how we create the props. And to use it again, we use the word props dot the key thing. So it will print the value Zeeshan. So it will print my name here. That's how it goes. Let's look at another problem and try to understand another example of how props are working. So here our first problem. We want to build a greeting card that says welcome Zeeshan, my name, or welcome some other person. That depends on what name we are passing to it. Okay, so props come to the rescue. Parent sends the name and favorite color to the card component, which customizes the message. This shows how props make a UI dynamic and personal. So in this case, we have a function called app. Again, another component. The main app function, it returns and it returns again what we call a greeting card. So what exactly is a greeting card? Again, another component that we have created here. This greeting card component now needs a prop. So we pass it as an argument a prop called name Zeeshan and a prop called name blue. Now again, this differentiates from the arguments because argument contain one value. In this case, we are just saying, hey, this will contain props. It can have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 depending on how many you have. So currently we have one key name and key value. We have second one color value. I can have more as well. Now based on this, I can make decisions and customize it. So that's what makes things much more interesting and simplifying within our React.js. So now we are passing a name and color. So the props will have actually both this information as an associative array form in a key and value form. Okay, so now we say, hey, I want to use this, so I will say props dot name. This name will be printed here. Props dot color will be printed here. So if I create another function, if I pass it something else, that information will be printed here. So same component actually is here, is used to print multiple values, can be used to print multiple values using the same arguments, having just something called props. Okay, so I don't need to specify different length of arguments. I don't need to specify different data types of arguments. I just specify props here. Okay, that's what makes this guy so wonderful. This props make everything easy. So you can pass it, like for example, one value, two value, next time it can be three value. If I create another greeting card, I can pass it four values. So some will have one value, some will have two, some will have three, depending on how I logically define my code. I can easily work with that. So that's what the beauty of props is, and that's how the props works. They are used to transfer the data, but at the same time, they are able to handle the key value pair and multiple key value pairs. So let's look at another example. So here, where it gets even more interesting. Props aren't just for data. You can pass functions too. Again, props do not only use data. That's why we're not calling them arguments, just like in JavaScript or in the language, because for arguments, they only take single value. However, when we talk about props, they actually can also use functions. So this is super handy when a child component needs to trigger something in the parent, like showing an alert or updating a state. Notice how the parent function is passed as a props and called when the button is clicked. So here we create an app function. We have again a button, show alert. So we define a function. So button handle click show alert. So this will call this thing. So whenever I have a click function, I want to execute it. I execute the show alert function here. So we define alert button click. Okay. So in this case, now we have a function called button or another component called button, but I want to pass my function as an alert here. So this button actually has been component called here, and instead of passing it a value, I am passing it this show alert function. So this show alert arrow function that I've created here has been passed as an argument to my button. So this handle click will be used here. So now in order to use this, I'm saying, hey, I have a button. Again, we create a button, define an on click event on it. Again, expression and angle brackets, and then I'm going to say props dot handle click. So this handle click is going to call this function here, handle click. This handle click now has a value, not a single value, but in fact another function itself, and that's why we again are using something called these angle brackets here. So do note this thing. Every time we use these square angle brackets or curly brackets, sorry, they basically represent an expression, means something is going to be evaluated in form of JavaScript. So because this is a function, we use the function to be evaluated. We use these curly brackets. So this is basically saying passing the function using props. So using props, you can not only pass the data, but the function as well. So here we have created another function component, and we have passed that function component here when we call the button component. So the button component now, instead of passing a value, has a function component. So this button is there. The prop will actually read this hand button component value, which is again another function, call button props dot handle. So when the handle is done, it actually executes the function. Okay, so this time the value will not be printed, but the execution of this function here will be carried out. Make sense? Hopefully a little bit, right? Let me just raise it. So what we're trying to do here is we say, hey, or in other words, let me define the execution flow of it. Let me erase a few things. Let's go back here, and we say when the code executes, it's first going to call this app function here, because this is the default function. So this function gets executed first. Then it defines another function here. So this becomes execution second, but this is not executed until the button is actually clicked. So this is not getting executed at all. So now the second thing that gets executed is this thing here, button code. So the second thing actually executes this thing. this will actually implement this button here. So what this is doing is it's calling this function component here. So when this function component is called, this is going to again return an HTML content. So this again itself is our HTML data. So this time this is like the third value. When HTML is executed, this content will be printed on the screen. As soon as user clicks on this event, so now we are waiting for the user to click on the event. So now we see, hey, on click event is there. This is the fourth. So as soon as user clicks on a button, an event is triggered. This event will actually call props.handleClick, which actually is this thing here. So now this function will be executed in terms of the fifth value, and the alert message is displayed. Make a little bit of sense? That's how props work if we pass the function definition. Okay, let's look at another example. So props shine when it comes to reusability. Imagine you need a products of cards for multiple items. Props let you reuse the same component with a different data. This makes your code cleaner, dry, which basically means don't repeat yourself, and easier to maintain. It's like creating a template and filling in the blanks. So if I want to create a simple card which has some data in it, for example, it can have an image, it can have a name, it can have a value, it can have some description, product, blah 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 things. I would just define this card 1 as a product card component. This would become my one component. Then I will just use props to pass in the data to fill in this bit of information. So this information, this information, this information, I will just fill in. So everything else is basically being designed by my component. The information is dynamically changing. To do that, we define a function called product card. Okay, returning again multiple lines of code. So because it's a multiple line of code, we have again bracket start, bracket close, semicolon. So we need to have a div. Again, every time we return, it needs to have an HTML as a return. We can only return HTML. If it's a single line, you can write it on the same line, multiple lines, brackets. Again, we have talked about this in the whole React course. If you haven't seen it, again, follow the channel. Everything is there. Then within this, we create h2 props. So we're calling the props product name. So for example, the product name is coming from here. Then we can say proper price. So the second value price can come from here, price. Add to cart button. So the another button that we create here. Again, this customization depends on whatever you want to do within your HTML. So anything can be here. So now notice the key thing. We have props. Again, using the same props word dot product name, props dot price, props dot any other information that you want. When you call this component inside your main app function, we again call the return div and we say, hey, product card. So because this product card is there, we call it once. Product name is going to be laptop, price, and any other information is there. If you want to put, you can just give it here. Then product 2, second product, again you call the same card. Reusability, the whole layout is already there. You just change the data that you want to be replaced with. This data can come from, for example, JSON or an SQL, anywhere from database. Any type of data is coming, you can dynamically load the content and display the cards. That way your website basically becomes faster with a reusable code. Again, using props, just changing the content wherever necessary. Stateful component. Now let's talk more about what exactly we mean by stateful components. Stateful components are like brains of your app. They can remember things like a state or in a form of a state and decide how to behave based on the state. Think of stateful components as your phone. It remembers you saved contacts, tracks calls, and handles all your dynamic actions. That's what our state basically means. So every time you open a phone, you maintain a call log, a call history is maintained. Okay, who called you? Even if you open WhatsApp, you have a history of your chat. That's what we mean by managing a state, remembering your previous actions. Every time you browse on your browser history is maintained, which is again what we call the state. Okay, so that's what a state actually means. Also called a class components. And you can create the same thing using functional components as well, especially using the hooks. So if you want to use the functional components, we use the component called functional components with hooks, which now in the latest version is most common. And in my future lessons also, if you follow along, you will find me using functional components with hooks for a stateful components as well. Let's look at the example for this. In a simple counter example, we are using a use state to track the counts and update whenever the button is clicked. How simple and easily it is done, right? So we have a button, we create an event called onClick, and then bracket start, bracket close, again an expression. Within this expression, we created a very simple function called setCount. Its setCount calls this setCount function here, which is basically being managed by the use state. So this use state will allow us to remember how many times we have clicked on a button, just like your history, just like your chat history, just like your contacts history, call history, log history. Use state will allow me to remember the value of count and the function it has, the number of time it has executed. That way we can remember the value and the amount of counts that has been done. Okay, so every time when we update this count plus one, it takes its current value and changes it. Okay, that's way our count is always maintained. So building a counter app becomes absolutely easy if you are working with this use state feature. So when you execute it for the first time, it starts from 0. The next time you click on a button, it will increment to 1. The next time you click on it button again, it will increment to 2, 3 and 4. It remembers what was the previous value of a count variable because we are using this use state feature. Now, how do we pass data between components? We have already seen a small examples of this as well already. Passing data between components is like sending message across your team. Props act as this medium. So props are absolutely important and imperative to use within components to pass information between the components. But what if two teams, sibling components, need to share information? That's where we lift the state to the boss, the parent component, and let it manage the data. It's all about calling a teamwork, which basically means working between components. So state lifting is a major concept. It allows us to share states between the siblings. The data we use with the props. But if you want to know the state of a particular component, we use the state lifting concept. So let's look at example of sharing states between siblings. So for example, if I have this and simple program in which I want to share information between my data. So first I create a component called app. It takes constant value, set value, use state. That becomes a standard syntax of anything of which you want to manage a state. This becomes my variable. This becomes my function name or a component name. Then it needs to return anything in specifically HTML. Okay, every component needs to have a return statement, needs to return an HTML content area. Very simple as that. But now we want to return the state as well. So to do that, we call a function called update. Okay, on update, we pass the value of set value. What exactly is an update thing? Well, let's look at here. So update is another component here. And then display becomes another component here. So see this is one component. This is second component. We are calling the first component here and the second component here. Every time you call a component, you pass it a value, it goes inside its value here. And that value is basically being printed here like a prop. At the same time, when you pass it on a state, you basically pass the state value information. This will actually shift the state onto the component here. Exactly in the same manner. So to passing the props, passing the value, you just pass it the variable's value as well as passing the state function as well. So set value will basically be passed on to on update, and then we can use on update mat.random, which basically means that whenever there's a value change, an update has occurred, the state has changed, you perform a random function and do some calculation on it. Right. Let's talk more about and see the difference between the stateless versus stateful components. Stateless components are like news reporters. They take information from a script, props, and present it. That's how basically they work. They are simplest type of React components. They receive the data via props and the render UI. That's whole their primary purpose is. They focus on displaying information. That's what we call as stateless components are. Stateful components are like diary writers. They remember things, which we call them state, and update them as needed. Okay, so that's why we said we use stateful components to manage dynamic data, something that needs to be remembered and tracked throughout the program's execution. You can handle user interactions, track changes, and updates. Okay, so every major application nowadays tends to use stateful components to track what user has been doing on my website. That's what we do. But if you just want to process the data, render a UI, and don't not concerned with what user is doing as per se, we use stateless components. Whereas if you want to manage and keep a record of all the activities, all the videos, all the YouTube shorts the user has watched, where he has liked, where has he disliked, what was the previous video he watched, we manage a stateful components. Again, a simple greeting message using stateless function. For example, in this case, our functional component just takes a name prop and displays it. So we have a component called greeting. It takes a component called prop, goes inside the prop and prints the name from it. A simple stateless function doing nothing as separately. Whereas stateful component now remembers what you are trying to do. So it becomes more complex. So while our class-based component remembers the name state internally. In this case, we provide a simple render hello this dot state dot name, means we are asking name from the state rather than prop. This basically means asking the information from our current class. So in my current class, we have a state, find the name, which is again this thing. Class, greeting, extends React component, creating a class-based component. To create a class-based component, we use the word class, greetings, and we extend React components. Previous examples all have used what we call functional components with use state hook. In this case, the use state hook has not been used. We are just using the class and this variable. So we are saying, hey, I have a constructor. Every class needs to have that. In ReactJS, we give it a prop value, bracket start, bracket close. Super props needs to refer to the super class variable, which again a super class constructor, which again is referring to this thing. Again, this is all in my React tutorial in detail when we've talked about it. But this is just the basic things. So now here's the state this we're managing. So we use this dot state is equal to name dot world, and then this name is actually referred here. So you can see this name comes here. This dot state becomes the built-in feature of managing the states. Okay. In this example, we split responsibilities. The user details component is stateless. It simply displays information. User profile component is stateful. It manages the name and age. By dividing the task, our code is easier to read and reuse. Imagine you are building a social media app. Each user's profile page could be built like this, and with a separate components for editing and displaying information. Okay, so here we just take the user information. We pass it the props, name and age, and we display it. That becomes one task. Next, we manage the user's activity using the user profile. So the user profile component is what we call stateful. It manages the name and age. By dividing the task, our code is easier to read and simpler. Okay, so here we have a variable, take a user profile information, we read through user.react. So this is where our state is being managed. Again, this is what we call a functional component. Okay, so this is a functional component. Previous example was class component. Because we are using functional component, we need to use the state. Okay, using the use state function. This one, this is again a part of our React hooks. Want to learn more? Again, do follow along. I have a complete 2, 3, 4 hour tutorial on components, hooks, and React using W3 Schools. So hopefully that should give you a much more in-depth of how things are working with that. So let's look at another example, a simple light bulb toggle. The stateful component shines when you need dynamic behavior. In our light bulb example, the is on state, this one, tracks whether the bulb is on or off. So using this information here, we track whether my bulb is on or off. When the button is clicked, the state flips. So when I click on a button, I set the on off with this not operator. So using this not operator here, I flip the state. Okay, so if let me just erase this so you can see this better. So this not operator is here. When the button is clicked, the state flips and the React automatically updates the UI. This is React magic. It does the heavy lifting for you and you don't have to refresh the page. Now let's talk more about state in a React. State is the heart of React. It lets your components become dynamic and responsive. In this example, we are creating a counter that updates in the real time whenever you click on a button. Powerful, yet very simple. So we do have a component called counter. We create a variable called constant and we define our state values is equals to use state angle bracket 0. This is where state is coming. It is used to store and manage dynamic data. Use the use state hook to manage the state in function components. So this is where we have managed our hooks components. And then again we use a return statement because we need to return a component and it needs to have what we call HTML content area. But because this time we are using multi-line HTML content area, we are using the bracket start and bracket close. So if you want to use multiple statements, you can use bracket start, bracket close and write multiple HTML lines. If it's a single line, then these brackets are not needed. Here we are using div p count value. Okay, so this count value actually comes from here. So this count variable value will be read here. Then we say button on click. So where you have a button on our React app, we create an event on it called on click. Again, bracket start, bracket close, indicating JavaScript expression. So in React, when we want to use JavaScript for expressions, we use these curly brackets. So we declared a arrow function. We said set count, count plus 1. So now we are using this set count function here. So this set count comes here as a function. So this is actually managing the state dynamically. So we dynamically created a function. We gave it an argument called count. We add one value to it. So every time user clicks on a button, this function is called. It adds value plus 1 to the current value of count. And that count value is printed here. It's managing the state, ensuring that the data is dynamically there and the value of these variables is maintained. So it remembers the value of count. So see how simply it is done and how powerfully it works. This is how we try to manage the states of any components, any buttons, anything that we want to keep in our app. As long as the web page is loaded, we want to manage the state, remember the name, remember the login details, remember the button values, remember the variable values. We use state in this order. So this becomes our typical syntax of it. There's a variable, there's a state count function that we have used there. So we're going to talk about what's the difference between React props and React state, when to use each, and in which situations we should be using each of them. So let's begin. Next up is the state. Picture a simple counter app. We are using React's use state hook here. Count is our state variable. Okay, so the count becomes our state variable. When you click on the button, the state updates and React automatically renders the UI. See how powerful the state is. It lets your React, pun intended, to users' interactions seamlessly. Again, in this case, the counter app takes a button. When user clicks on this button, we call it JavaScript function. So we use bracket start, bracket close. This becomes our JavaScript expression. Inside this, we call a component called set count, and we use this count state. Because we want to maintain that every time user clicks on this button, the value of this count becomes plus 1. So take the current value of count and add 1 to it. Next time user clicks on a button, again now take the current value of count and add 1 to it. So for example, the first time when you execute the code, the count is starting with 1. The next time I click on it, now it takes the current value of count, okay, which is count plus 1, adds 1 to it and assigns it back to the count. The next time it adds again, so this is basically like a loop. It behaves like a loop. So every time you click on this button, it takes the current value of count, adds 1 to it and then assigns it back to the variable count. Hence the value of count is updated. To maintain this state, we use the constant count, set count, use state 0, meaning that we are changing the data inside the count variable, making it a non-immutable value. So you can update it, change it again and again while maintaining its previous value. So every time user clicks on count, the value of this count is updated through the set count component, and it changes or maintains the state here. That's how we use it. So what becomes the key difference? Here the side-by-side comparison is given. Props are about sharing. Isn't it nice to share? They let you pass the data around the components, like a parent passing notes to the kids. So the sharing comes into mind. But the state, that's a component's personal diary. It tracks the data that changes over time. So it's your personal diary. That basically means that it belongs to a personal data, a personal component, and they can change their diary regularly. So a prop cannot be changed. A state, because it's your personal components, local to each component, it can be changed as it goes along. Both are crucial, but each serves a unique purpose. So you cannot say that I can use anything interchangeably. They both have a very unique and specific purpose. It's like the yin and the yang of React. Balance here is the main key. So you need to understand where to use the props and where to use the state. That's where the yin and yang concept comes into play. So we pass it to the parent from the child. It is immutable and the shared between components, yes, but you cannot change it because it's immutable. Whereas state becomes immutable, it's mostly known as local to the component. So whenever it's defined, it's only a part of that particular component. Manage dynamic component data that needs to be changed within a component, maintaining its previous state. That's how we basically identify it. That's the key difference between each. So any situation where you need to just pass the data to a component and then component has to use this data without changing it, that's where the props come into play. But any situation where you need to pass the data to a component, where component can change the data, work on the data, process the data, that's where the state comes into play. So once you want to change the data locally inside a component, you basically use a state. Once you just want to render the data that's been given to a state, to work on it, but don't change it, that's where the props come into play. Hopefully makes sense, right? So let's mix props and state. In this to-do app, the to-do list components uses props to get the title and the state to manage the dynamic list of tasks. So if I say we want to just create a to-do app, I use the use state prop from the React. Again, the whole complete code is there. So we need to use this import statement, so ensuring that our state is created. I said okay. Then we go and we create a component called to do list. Okay, it takes a title. Now this title basically behaves like a prop because we just want the title, we don't want to change it. Because this content does not need to be changed, we pass it as a prop. Hence, that's a prop given to our component. But when we want to add more tasks which can later be changed, modified, updated, that's where the state comes into play. So now we use the use state functions here. This allows us to add the tasks or as individual task. Make sense? So notice how props bring in fixed data here, while the state manages the user's input. So the state here manages the user's input, the data that users enters in form of tasks. And they update the content in real time. Combining these two creates a dynamic and a reusable app. Pretty amazing, right? So in this case, when the user clicks on input, types in a value, whatever value is there, we basically provide it as a task. Then on change, whenever user wants to change something, we call the set task component e.target.value. So we just pass it the current value that user is passing. So as the user is typing the value, the data goes into our state here. Button on click add task. As soon as you click on a task, that task is basically added to the task list through this add task component. So this add task component here basically uses the function and adds the data inside our tasks. This creates a very simple to-do app. So we create an app function and we call this to-do component list, to-do list component to add the content here. So the title is coming from the prop and the tasks are actually, because the states needs to be maintained, is coming from the use state function here. Make sense? Simple as that. So using a simple props and state features, we are able to manage a simple web app. Now, let's look into a more example. In this case, the problem is that we need to build a reusable button component that can display different labels and styles based on the props. So based on what I provide on the prop, the buttons basically need to change. So the props are perfect for customizing components. Here we create a reusable but reusable button component. It accepts the label and style as the props to determine its text and appearances. This lets you create a consistent UI elements while maintaining flexibility. Imagine designing a whole website where every button has a unique purpose but follows a consistent design pattern. Props make this an easy and elegant way. So what we do is we create a button, give it a label, for example, submit button. We give it a CSS style attribute. Again, this is an HTML, and then we provided an argument called background color, blue and white. In this case, background color, red and white. So we provide certain styles to the listing. Then we create a button component. We provided a label and a style. So when we define the button, we give it a consistent style and we created a consistent label. So the output would be basically we get two buttons, one labeled as submit with blue color background and the other with a cancel with a red color background. That way we maintain the UI elements consistency as well. Hey, let's look at one more example. In this case, we use state for user interactions. So here where state shines, handling user interactions. Okay, this is where the state absolutely is wonderful because it is able to maintain and manage the user's input and user's interaction, and it knows what user is trying to do through the states, because again state maintains what's happening. It maintains the state. So in this example, is dark mode keeps track of the current theme and clicking the button toggles the light and the dark mode. Using this dynamic behavior is all thanks to the state. It allows the UI to adapt instantly based on users' actions. And guess what? Users love a good theme toggle. Almost every website needs to have this. So we create a button called toggle theme. When user clicks on this button, it actually calls this component here, toggle theme button. In this case, we maintain a state is dark mode is set dark mode. Hence, when I click on this, we create another component here. We set it is dark mode. If it is, inverse it. So this means it changes the variable here. So use state mode becomes a key component here that maintains and knows in which state am I currently in. So if I am in my dark mode, the negation here, this negation will actually change this dark into the light theme by making it false. If I'm already in the false mode, which basically means I'm in the light mode, this will switch back to it. So very easily we can toggle between dark and light by just using this negating and maintaining the current state here. Okay. So whenever I click on a button to toggle the theme, I just call my component. It checks if I am in a dark mode, change it to light. If I'm not in the dark mode, make it dark. So this toggle effect can be very easily maintained here. Okay. So this is what basically we're trying to do using the state. So users interaction can easily be understood and notified by while maintaining the state here. No need for prop here. Finally, let's see one last example, combining props and state for a shopping cart. Now again, this is not a complete shopping cart, just a simple example of how things are working. So let's combine props and state to create a shopping cart. The cart item component uses props to display the details while the shopping cart component manages the cart and the total price using the state. Every time you add an item, okay, every time you click on a button to add an item, the state gets updated. Okay, so every time I click on this button here, this state updates the current information in my cart. The state updates the cart array and then the total cost. This kind of dynamic functionality is which basically makes a modern web apps engaging and user friendly. React props and states work together beautifully to bring this all to life. So as soon as user clicks on a button, the item is added into the cart and the cart state is updated along with its total cost. But at the same time, when the cart is updated, I also update the name and the price information here as well. So we work together in terms of props and state. So here we are using again props to update the name and price. Here we are using state to maintain the items that are currently in my cart and their total price. So using both informations, I can very easily manage the shopping cart application. Next, let's talk more about event handling in React. I just show you an example of on-click already, but again, we have various other ways of managing events. So through events, we handle user actions like clicks and inputs. Interactivity is what React excels at. With event handlers, you can make your components respond to users' actions, like clicking a button or typing in a box. Here we are logging a simple message to the console when a button is clicked. So we again create a React component called handle click. We say go on to console.log, again a simple JavaScript. We say button click. So every time user clicks on a button, this component is called. So we go inside a button using an HTML. On click event is created a simple HTML code. Then again curly brackets indicating our JavaScript expression. And then we call this handle click component. See, note there's no brackets needed here now because we are directly calling a component. It doesn't need to have the brackets. So it's going to call this component here. Now this means that every time I click on a button, this component will be called, which in return will actually call this component, and then it will print but console.log. This way you can have any state, any functionality within your code. How simply it's managed, how beautifully it's managed, how easily it can be controlled. Okay, so similarly you can have on click, on change, on key press, on key release, whatever events you want to handle, you can handle by very simply using the standard JavaScript on click and then expression and then calling the component that you want to be executed when the button is clicked. Wow, wonderful, right? Now let's talk more about how we handle forms. So forms and control components in React. Forms are a staple of web development. Every web page standardly needs a starting from a login form to registration form to many other various different ways where your forms are involved. With control components, React ensures that the form inputs are always in sync with the app's current state. This example showcases a form that updates the user's name in real time. So for example, if you have a problem that says create a form to collect and display user's name. To do that, again, we created a component, form example, bracket start, bracket close. We declare a constant. We set a name variable and a set name function. And we defined a use state. So this will ensure that we are maintaining the state. Then we declare another variable called constant, handle change. And then we declare an event, which is again default event handling by React. Arrow function, set name, again this function is called here event.target.value. So when I create a form, return form input.text, so I have a value, name, on change, handle change. So when the value is changed, it's actually going to call this name parameter. Then as soon as I change the value, that dynamically the content is updated and the event is validating the things. So it dynamically shows hello whatever name you are writing. So as you are writing the name, your name gets updated on the field. So we on the text field, we are calling the value and we are using this expression called name. And then on change event is triggered here. This on change event in this case is just simply displaying the name, but then you can change it to do whatever you want. So in other words, check the value, check whether the data exists in the database. As a type A, find all the elements or the data or the users that have a name. Whatever events you want to target, you can easily go and put them inside the function here. So we declare and handle change event that basically gets executed every time an event is triggered. Okay, so because of this, we actually are executing the function every time event is occurring. Make sense? Hopefully do. So again, quick examples of how these things work. So this is very intuitive way of managing events and form controls. We can control not only the input fields but any other component for that matter as well using the same thing. The value is dynamically updated by the user. So every time user enters something here, on change event is called. On change will actually trigger this thing. Using the state management, we maintain the previous characters that the user had entered. That way my state is maintained. If you don't do that, it means every time you press A, an event is triggered. That event will actually cancel out the value. So you need to ensure that you keep on entering more values. To do that, we manage the state so that technically your state is managed and you can enter multiple characters. More of React, we use something called React Router for navigation. React Router is like a GPS for your app. It helps users navigate between different pages without refreshing the browser. With links and routes, you can easily structure your app into a logical sections. That's the major advantage of using React Router. So for example, if we have a problem that create a simple app with a home and about page. So with the same thing, we can go and we can import browser route as a router. So we need to include this import statement. Then we say route and link, provide two other parameters for this router functions from React router.dom. So in other words, this React route has already been created and we are importing the library for it from this React router.dom application. So all the content are imported here as browser router. So now what we need to do is we need to use these components here. To do that, we come here and we say function app. So we create our function. It returns again the first rule of components. It needs to have a function and an app name, and then it needs to return a value, and that value has to be something called an HTML. In this case, we created a router function. Then we say link go to home page. So we create one link. Then we create link go to about page, create another link. This is simple HTML kind of a concept. But now we are using the router tags, not the HTML tags. The route path backslash exact component home and the route path about component home. This is where we provide the navigation path to that where we want to take the components to. Through this way, we manage our app's navigation between different pages. So user can navigate between pages on the same browser's web area without actually having the need to refresh. This way, your web pages are loaded more dynamically, more accurately, and much more faster, having you and giving you a easily a logical structure of various different sections, even within the same web page. So it's very important and essential concept within our React. Next, let's talk more about React hooks, use state, and use effect. Hooks bring React to life. With use state, you can add interactivity, and with use effect, you can handle tasks like fetching the data or reacting to its changes. They are a game changer for functional components in our React. So for example, we have a problem that log a message whenever counter is incremental. Okay, so whenever a user increments a counter, we want to log a message for it. To do that, again we create a component app bracket start bracket close. We define constant count as a variable, set count as a function, and we use state, again the standard state management in React. Then we say use effect. Again, as I said, this is the second part here. So use effect, it allows us to handle tasks like fetching data. So this use effect, we will fetch the data or react to certain changes or anything that's happening. So in this case, that happening thing is the count fetcher. So we are saying, hey, when something is changing, use effect function is called or component is called with an arrow function. bracket start bracket close, console.log count updated. So update the value of count. Notice the dollar sign here, bracket start bracket close. So it's printing the value of count here dynamically and then updating the value of count with the function. And then we return button on click. Again, we create an arrow function called set count and we increment the value. So every time the set count value is updated, the value is managed in the set state. And because we are changing and some event has occurred, it automatically prints this message as well. So this allows us, or this is what we call hooks inside our React. These hooks allows us to manage various different things within our React app. In this case, we are using first managing the state, second managing the effect. Okay, so this effect will handle various different things, or in other words, reacting based on any change that is there, and we are maintaining the change through this use state feature. So use state is managing the change, any change that occurs, anything that's changing, maintain it, and then when there is a change, use the use effect function. That way we have complete control of what we want to do in our web page. So every time something is changing, keep a record of that, and then once we have a record based on that change, we call an use effect method. That effect method can have any data, anything that you want to do. So in this case, we're just simply printing the count value on our console. Understand? Hopefully do. So this is one other thing that's quite essential within our React. Next, we're going to talk about styling in React. For example, being able to change CSS and inline CSS styles of an HTML component. To do that, in React, you can use regular CSS or inline CSS styles. Inline CSS style are JavaScript objects, giving you the flexibility to calculate styles dynamically. So in this example, we are applying custom styles to a heading. So we create again another function for a problem that style a heading with a custom font size and a color using inline CSS. So that's what we're trying to target. So we say, hey, constant style is equals to color blue font size. So see, notice it's just the standard code. So we define a style parameter, behave like a variable in sense of JavaScript. This becomes our object. And this is again key and value pair, key and value pair. So key and a value pair, key and a value pair. We give this value to our object called style. Now to use it, we say, hey, return h1 style. Again, this is now HTML style attribute is equals to expression, bracket start, bracket close. So see this, almost everything we write of JavaScript inside these bracket angle brackets. So these brackets indicate that we are writing some JavaScript. What is JavaScript? We apply this style here. So we then pass this as an argument here. So now when this HTML will be executed on the browser, it's going to print h1 style attribute, again an HTML attribute is equals to this style. This will be dynamically replaced by this content here, which then basically means, hey, we are changing inline CSS. So this is how we process the inline CSS within our JavaScript using our JavaScript and React. Understand? Very nice and very easily handled. More advanced concepts. Now let's get a little bit more in depth of React. So in React, we have something called lazy loading. Lazy loading speeds up our app, even though name is lazy. But the way it works is that you code lazily and it improves the efficiency of your code. So lazy loading speeds up your app by loading components only when they are required. It's like just-in-time delivery service for your app's code. So for example, if you have seen websites like Apple's website or websites like Netflix or Facebook, you keep on scrolling. So you see there are so many posts, but those posts are not there all by default. As you are scrolling, the demand requires them to recycle the components in the layout and then load the contents dynamically. So that's one way or one example of how lazy loading works. It loads the component only when they are needed. So Apple's website, when they promote their website, you see it's a one large giant web page. As you are scrolling, their components are basically browsing up and next components are loading, giving you an illusion that it's like a complete big video. And as you're scrolling, the video is playing and the components are unfolding, the design is changing, the location is changing. It just creates amazing effects. Okay, so that's done through lazy loading. Okay, lazy loading. So for example, load a component only when it's needed, the basic structure. To do this lazy component loading, we again create a constant variable called lazy component is equals to, we use something called react.lazy function. This function allows us to load the component when it's needed. To do that, we again use bracket start, bracket close. Inside this argument, we create an arrow function. We use import statement and we import our component which we want to load at that specific moment. Okay, so see this, now we are dynamically importing another component and then using this lazy function, saving it in a lazy component. Then we create our own another component called main app. It returns, and then we use this suspense tag. So now we are using the suspense tag, fallback, and bracket start, bracket close, again JavaScript, and then inside it we use div loading, and then we provide our lazy component here. So this lazy component now becomes is now called here, again using the angle brackets, and the suspense tag is closed. This is a simple structure, a simple way of how we want to call this lazy function. So now wherever we call this in this particular way, only at this point the component will be loaded when this function is in a fallback situation. Until then, it's in a default point. So it dynamically loads the components as needed, reducing the initial load time. So if you see Facebook website or Netflix website, you see there's a huge list of components, but they are not loaded by default. As you're scrolling and browsing through, the components are loaded dynamically using the simple load component strategy. That's how the lazy component works in our React. Then we have something called higher order components in our React. This is again another advanced level things. So these higher order components are like decorators for components. They let you add functionality without changing the original component. In this example, we are added a logger to a track render. So for example, we say we have a problem, and then problem is that we need to add a logging to multiple components without the duplicating code. So this higher order component has been included that allows us to do that. So we again create a component called function with the logger name. We create something called a wrapper component. We call the return function, and it returns a function called logger props. Bracket start, bracket close. Then it calls the console.log component rendered, return, wrapper component, and the props. So what now it is doing is it's like behaves like a function that takes a component. So this wrapper component itself is a component and returns a new enhanced component used by adding. So for example, it's like we have one component here, but we want another component to be created, but we want to use this component inside here. So now we add this component here. So this becomes our wrapper component. Okay, so this wrapper component is worked inside the logger component. Make sense? Little bit, right? So to include another component in your main component, we call this thing here. So now we have a function called with logger wrapped component. We return the function logger. So it's like creating a component inside a component. Okay, so this function logger props, again taking one props, bracket start, bracket close, console.log, and then this function again returns another function here. So it's like this component is there. This component again has another sub function here. This becomes our with logger main component, and this here becomes the logger component. So with logger is the outer and the inner is logger. That way we enhance the functionality of one component and include it into another. So you can say that this is our component, but we want to enhance its functionality including its own features. Can be considered as inheritance, can be considered, but in React terms we call it higher order components. So we are incorporating one component inside another component at runtime. That's how the React components works. It enhances the functionality while adding the new features to an already created component. Okay. Now, finally, once we have all this, how do we deploy a React app? That's one of the most commonly asked questions. So once your app is ready, deployment is the final step to share it with the world. Platforms like Netflix make it incredibly easy to host and manage your React apps. A few clicks and you are live. So the basic steps we follow is that you build the app using the npm run build function. So this is the run build code that you need to use. So you type in our terminal npm run the build and it will build the file and create your final output. Simple as that. Host it, you can use the platforms like Netlify, Vercel or GitHub pages to host your newly built component. Steps for deployment on the GitHub is that you push the code to GitHub, you connect the GitHub repo to your Netflix, and then you deploy. Same way. Simple as. Understand? So that's the basics of what our React looks like. So before we wrap it up, let's recap the big ideas we have covered today. First, React component based architecture is a game changer for building a reusable and scalable user interfaces. Right? So the just JSX is it's your friend. You need to familiarize with yourself. It blends JavaScript with HTML very easily, making your code much cleaner and reusable. And don't forget the state and the props things. They are how React manages your data. Okay. So the virtual DOM keeps things speedy. So the virtual DOM makes things much more easy and smooth. Okay. So lastly, the React is a very easily component based structure. So make sure you understand how these components and everything works with that. Okay. So that concludes the basics of React.js course. This session. I hope you've understand it, you have learned it. If you have enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe this channel and leave your comment down below. Okay. Let me know what else you want to learn with the React, what else tools you want to work with, and I'll try to build on that. Do check out these cool videos on the React that I've already posted about hooks, states, and other components on the React that I've just talked about. So you can follow along. This is Dr. Zeeshan signing off.